Hello, everybody. It's Friday, September the 19th, 2025. Yesterday, we did a show with the Dutch-based moral economist Ingrid Robin. She's the author of Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. And one of the arguments she makes against extreme wealth is that it stymies innovation. She believes that we need to put a cap on the super rich in order to make our societies more innovative. Part of our argument depended on the work of economists like Mariano Mazzucato, who's been on the show before. Her book, The Entrepreneurial State, suggests that much innovation, especially when it comes to technology, emanates from the state. This conversation about innovation, about how we get the most innovation, is also the focus of another new book out this week. It's called How Progress Ends, Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. It's by Carl Benedict Frey, who teaches at Oxford University and is joining us now. Carl, congratulations on the new book. Are you making a moral argument in this book or an economic one? What's the core argument in favor of progress?
So my argument is primarily economical, but I would note that if you look at the correlation between income per capita and reported subjective well-being, it's 0.8. So it's pretty strong. And so, people are voting with their feet every day, and they tend to move to places with higher income levels and better prospects for themselves and their children. And so I think you can, quite easily make an argument that, economic growth is moral. And so you don't necessarily need to distinguish between the two.
Your book is a historical analysis of how we get to innovation. Lots of very interesting case studies. You also wrote an interesting op-ed last month in the New York Times, which was entitled, I know you don't always put the titles together, the 1970s gave us industrial decline. AI could bring us something worse. A lot of your book focuses on the impact of AI in terms of innovation. How does AI play out in terms of progress? Is AI, in your view, at least at this point in late September 2025, is an example of how we get progress or how progress could conceivably end?
Well, I think artificial intelligence should give us some glimmer of hope that we might experience a revival of productivity and economic growth. A key challenge, not just facing Europe and Britain, where I live, but also the United States, and I should say China, where productivity has been in the negative territory and stagnant by more optimistic estimates since the Great Recession, we would need a little bit of a boost to deal with a lot of our problems, whether it's demographic challenges, whether it's our public finances, whether it's the need to boost defense spending. All of those challenges require faster economic growth. And the key concern to me is that AI is not, at least so far, living up to the expectation. And in fact, the computer revolution did not quite live up to the expectation either in terms of economic growth. If you think about it, it's hard to think of anything more transformative than the personal computer and the internet. It essentially allowed us to connect the best talent in the world, the best academics, researchers, inventors, and it gave people essentially the world's stored knowledge in their pockets, and yet we just see a little blip, an upsurge in productivity in the US that peters out after a decade, and we don't even really see it in Europe.
All this reminds me of that. I think it was a conversation, but certainly between a Chinese diplomat and Henry Kissinger. Kissinger asked them about, and a communist diplomat, about what he thought of the French Revolution. The response was, it's a bit early to tell. I wonder whether it's certainly too early to tell on the internet. Of course, the The book about bubbles that I've often referred to, Carlota Perez's Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, suggests that the internet, like AI, is a kind of bubble, creates all this excess capacity, which is eventually used. So in time terms, Carl, how do we measure progress when it comes to something like AI? You say they've been exaggerated, but there are all these crazy boosters out here in Silicon Valley about AI. Lots of skeptics too, but it's going to take decades, maybe even centuries, for the real impact of AI to work itself out, in the same way as the Industrial Revolution worked itself out over decades and centuries. If we were having this conversation in the early part of the 19th century, we might be discussing something quite similar.
I think that's right. So technological revolutions take time. It took a century for steam to deliver its full impact to economic growth. It took around 4 decades for electricity to show up in the productivity statistic. We saw a similar trajectory with ICT, and so it stands to reason that it will take some time for AI, and we shouldn't, in a way, expect a huge upsurge already. But I'm also not sure that it's just a matter of, hang in there and wait and the gains will follow. I think it really depends on what we use the technology for. And so, if all we've done since 1800 was automation, we would have productive agriculture, we would have cheap textiles, but not much else, right? We wouldn't have antibiotics, vaccines, rockets, computers, airplanes, cars, etc. And so most wealth, most progress, most growth comes from doing new and previously inconceivable things. It comes from developing new types of industries. In the mid 20th century, where we saw the largest upsurge in productivity growth, we created entirely new industries. The automobile industry was the largest enterprise the world had ever seen. And it created, in addition, a host of industries supplying all the components that go into making a car, a host of new industries making the machine tools to make the components, a host of new industries around electricity, and essentially every gadget we have in our kitchen stems from that era, and there was an industry behind it. Created road commerce, tourism, around personal transportation. And we haven't seen anything like that scale with the computer revolution yet, and certainly not with AI. And most of the applications I can think of are certainly about processes and automation, not new types of activities. So, well, maybe they will arrive, but it's also possible that they don't. And I think in part depends on, competition and dynamism.
Yeah, it's interesting, Carl. You know a million times more about this than I do. You're a scholar of this stuff, and in fact, you were on the show 6 years ago talking about similar themes. Back in September of 2019, you had a new book out, The Technology Trap: Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation. But I'm not convinced, anecdotally, that you're right on the computer revolution. Maybe we don't look in our kitchen. I take your point. Maybe our kitchens today in 2020 look not that different from our kitchens of 1950 or 60 or 70. They have the toasters and the ovens. We still drive our cars. But the impact of technology in our culture, in our politics, in our society is so profound. We did a show earlier this week on millennials, and the author of the book, who's a millennial himself, all he could talk about was screens, the impact of screens on loneliness, on anxiety, on how we think about oneself. So I would argue in broad terms that maybe outside quantifiable economics, the computer revolution, particularly the networked internet revolution, is having a massively profound impact on how we live.
I agree with all of that, and I'm struck that the examples you mentioned about loneliness and screen time are things that we, rather think of being negative developments rather than positive ones. And I struggle to recall people, worrying that people tend to spend too much traveling and in their cars when the automobile arrived. So I do think that we haven't seen that much of an upsurge in productivity and innovation as a result
But Carla,
of
again, I'm
the
jumping in
computer
here. I mean, you and
revolution.
I are having this conversation on the internet. It's being broadcast in real time. You're in Oxford, I'm in San Francisco. To us, this is just another day. We don't give it another thought. I mean, had we presented this idea to each other if we'd have been around in the 60s or 70s, we'd be utterly amazed. So there are real consequences of this. I take your point on the negative aspect, although there was all sorts of negative narratives as well about the automobile in the 60s and 70s, which in some ways were realized.
No, I agree with you. I use the internet on my computer every
Every
day,
hour,
so
I
I
would
can't
guess,
say
probably
that.
every minute. You're probably on your machines as much as anyone. You probably research this. I mean, could you have written this book, How Progress Ends, without Google, without access to network technology?
It would have taken me a lot longer, but people did write
No, I
serious
take your
work
point
before
on
the
that.
computer made it. But look, I've benefited an enormous amount, and in a way, that's my point. These are really astounding technologies. So as I said earlier, well stored knowledge in my pocket. I can speak to some of the most brilliant people in the world on the other
Including
side of the
myself, Carl,
planet.
right?
Exactly. That's what was exactly the point I was trying to make. And so, that's extraordinary. But it's even more extraordinary in a way that we don't see it either in the productivity statistics or in measures of breakthrough innovation or in research productivity, right? So it takes 7 times as many engineers today to produce Moore's law as it did in the 1970s. And in a way, you can expect that to happen in a given industry over time. Progress becomes more incremental, but we're seeing it in the macroeconomic statistics too. The same stagnation, and so that is what I find so striking, so worrying, and what leaves me thinking that we shouldn't, depend on AI revitalizing economic growth, or at the very least, we shouldn't take it for
it's
granted.
ironic. Even if we supposedly live at this time of exponential technological innovation with AI, we do shows on it almost certainly every week, sometimes almost every day. Your argument is that in How Progress Ends is that in the 2020s are more like the 70s. We have a lot of technology, but that doesn't guarantee progress. Is that the argument in the book?
Well, the argument is mainly that institutions need to adjust to technological changes to be able to explore and exploit them as they emerge. So, I'm certainly not the first person out there to write a book about the wealth and poverty of nations, but I do think that this framework that I'm trying to outline is important, because most of the factors that economists and scholars of development tend to point to are basically fixed or relatively static over many decades. So some scholars argue, for example, that geography explain differences in economic performance across space. Yet the geography of the Soviet Union, for example, was the same in the 1950s when it grew rapidly, and in 1991, just before it collapsed. Culture was broadly speaking the same, or you could even argue that it was a bit more open when it collapsed, because the radio and television waves from Europe, there was no amount of barbed wire that could stop them traveling through the Iron Curtain, where people got exposed to Western ideas. And property rights, even though Gorbachev introduced significant reforms, were by no means secure throughout, right? And so what explains, A, the rapid growth that the Soviet Union experienced for several decades, and B, also the collapse. And the point I'm making is that the Soviet Union was very good at mobilizing resources and scale up existing technology. So it took much of the mass production system it imported from the United States, and then you had bureaucrats that could essentially monitor performance across factories by benchmarking and comparing performance across them. But that works as long as technology is static, not in flux. And when something is new, well, it's much harder to benchmark and to monitor performance. And you needed something new after the 1970s.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the Soviet Union as an example of progress. I mean, my understanding of the Soviet Union, even in the most optimistic take, is it was innovative when it came to military technology, but that was only because the state essentially appropriated all resources and labor in the country in order to direct it towards military innovation and keeping up with the Americans. We had the famous Sputnik moment. I want to come to a Sputnik moment later. Can we really use the Soviet Union as a model, any kind of model for innovation, Carl?
No, and that is my point. The Soviet Union did reasonably well in taking existing technology and scaling. But when something new was needed, and that new thing was the computer revolution, its contributions were virtually zero. And the reason for that is that the Soviet system didn't permit exploration. And you need to have different peoples in the economy taking different bets and exploring different technological trajectories to know what might catch on, right? And so if you were an aircraft engineer in the Soviet Union, you could go to the Red Army and ask for funding. If they turn you down, there were 2 or 3 other places you can go. If they turn you down, your idea would die with you. And conversely, in the United States in 1999, Bessemer Venture declined to invest in Google. Now, that might sound silly in retrospect, but it was by no means clear at the time that Google would emerge as the company it did. Yahoo and Alta Vista were dominating search. And so Google was by no means a safe bet. But the fact that Bessemer Ventures didn't invest didn't mean that Google was doomed, because others invested. And that's the benefit of a decentralized system. People can take different bets and explore technological trajectories, and that's particularly important at the frontiers of technology.
We're talking in a week, Carl, where Elon Musk, he always seems to be in the headlines for one reason or other. He's in the headlines. He just earlier this week bought $1 billion worth of shares in Tesla. He's been offered a package, a $1 trillion package, which even the Pope has criticized. He's been in the news over the last year because of his attempt to reform the state, and with Doge, which he got a very bad press on. He isn't the most popular fellow, certainly in progressive circles. But are you arguing really for the Musk model? Are you arguing in favor of Doge? Are you arguing for taking the chainsaw to government bureaucracies, whether it's in DC or Moscow or London or Paris or Berlin? Is that the key argument? So are you on the same page as Mazzucato when it comes to the entrepreneurial state? Are you suggesting that really the state is by definition anti-entrepreneurial?
I don't think I'm on the same page as either, to be honest with you. So Doge got it backwards. So if you want to reduce the size of the state, what you need to do is reduce and cut regulation. So the reason that the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service in the United States, is a huge operation is that the tax code is tremendously complex, and there is a new variety of loopholes, etc. And so if you want to reduce the size of the IRS, you can introduce a flat tax or simplify the tax code at the very least. If all you do is go on with the chainsaw and cut bureaucracy, all you do is reduce the capability of the state to enforce the rules on the books, and you are, in addition to that, reducing the capacity of the state to perform essential functions, whether it's public goods or whether it's building infrastructure or whether it's something else. And so I think that project got it entirely backward. I don't think that the state, so to speak, has been the key driver of innovation either. I certainly take the point that a lot of innovation and a lot of the research has been state funded, but that doesn't mean that the state has performed it. And if you look at most of these, missions that people tend to cite as driving growth and progress in the post-war period, well, first of all, America's productivity miracle predated the war. So the productivity upsurge began in the 20s, long before the mission economy. During the post-war period, Europe, Japan, even the Soviet Union closed the gap to the United States. So post-war economic performance can certainly not be in the US directly a consequence of these state-led programs. And if you look at perhaps the most transformative publicly funded technology that emerged as a predecessor to the modern internet, well, that was very much done by Licklider. The conceptual ideas for it were created before he joined ARPA, and there was certainly no plan whatsoever to create the modern internet. In fact, ARPA would probably have been a failure had it not been the case that the United States had a decentralized network of universities competing for jobs and competing for talent. That was the foundation for everything. And so my argument is not so much the state should do it or the private sector should do it. We should think about whether we provide funds in a decentralized, competitive manner or not. And that is true for both public funds and private funds.
And you compare two American cities in terms of reinvention, Detroit, which is often used in these sorts of arguments, and Boston. What can Boston and Detroit, or the Boston and Detroit models, tell us about how to successfully innovate as opposed to perhaps stagnating?
So I draw a contrast in the book between Silicon Valley and New England, broadly speaking, which was the center of the second industrial revolution. And I make the point that Silicon Valley was more competitively organized. Part of that reason was that in California, non-compete clauses were unenforceable, which meant that when Shockley Semiconductor did not perform as some of its engineers expected, they could leave and set up Fairchild Semiconductor. And then later on, two of those employees could leave to set up Intel.
Actually, three, if you add Andy Grove, of course. He wasn't the founder, and we got Moore's Law out of it and all the rest of it. Yeah, so go on.
Indeed, and that job hopping was absolutely essential to the renewal of Silicon Valley. But Detroit and Michigan went in the opposite direction. It actually made non-competes enforceable back in 1985. And as a result, the dynamism of the region declined. And so I make the case in the book that that's really a key driver of dynamism in the Bay Area. It's not so much that it received a lot of state funding, which it did, but even more of that went to the Boston region. And within California, most of it actually went to Los Angeles rather than the Bay Area. So yes, that played a role too, but it wasn't the decisive
And
factor.
so, what does that teach us today? You talk about the current challenge of San Francisco, New York, Seattle, other service capitals laying the groundwork for innovation. What advice would you give city managers, innovators, people investing in new infrastructures for innovation, new wealth, new progress?
So I think a lot of people mistakenly believe that today's service capitals like New York City and London are relatively safe because they're protected by diversification in a way that, let's say, Detroit or Pittsburgh wasn't. But in this case, the disruptor AI is a general purpose technology. It cuts across a range of functions and industries. And I think AI in its current form is far from perfect. It still requires a human in the loop, but it makes many things that used to be hard much easier, whether it's writing, financial modeling, coding, etc. And what that means is that more people can perform it. So I often make the point that it's a little bit like what Uber did to taxi services. With the arrival of GPS technology, knowing the name of every street in New York was no longer a particularly valuable skill. And then with the Uber app matching supply and demand, basically anybody with a driver's license could get into his or her car and top up their income on the side. And as a result, we saw incumbent taxi drivers' wages fall as a consequence. A big difference this time around, of course, is that professional services are traded, and so they can be done somewhere else. And if you look at the income of a software engineer in Manila and in the Bay area, it's an order of magnitude higher in the Bay Area. And so that means that if AI reduces the productivity differential between those workers, more of that activity can be shifted towards Manila. And that's true in accounting and consulting.
Yeah, you got to want to live. When were you last in Manila, Carl?
I think it was in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, I was there a couple of years ago at my friend Maria Ressa's conference. I mean, it's quite an experience to go there. I'm not sure anyone would particularly want to live there, though, in terms of quality of life. And my sense is that for all these new technologies, we were promised that place would become irrelevant in the internet revolution, that anyone could live anywhere. And if anything, it's actually made real estate more valuable in San Francisco and New York. So the odd thing about technology is the more it kind of undermines place, the more valuable certain places, London, New York, San Francisco, seem to become.
So I think that's right. But first of all, the argument is not that people have to move to Manila. So
no, I
the
know.
work can be done with people
in
living
Manila
in
live in Manila, and
so
right.
You can see, you can so that relocation can still happen. So I certainly think that AI, in many ways, will make in-person communication more valuable, right? And so if AI writes all of your letters and everybody else's, how do you distinguish yourself in such a world? It's going to be through in-person communication. And I think there will be some cities that facilitate in-person meetings and that still provide these hubs for innovation that New York City and Silicon Valley have in the past. And it's also possible that those places will reinvent themselves and continue to be this hub. So Boston successfully reinvented itself 4 times in the wake of technology.
And it continues to. I was just in Somerville a few months ago. It's, again, a remarkably different place from when I lived there in the 1980s. We haven't talked about Europe, Carl. You're originally from Germany. You teach at Oxford. You wrote an interesting piece in the for the IMF about how the battle for control could crush AI's promise, and you talked about a Sputnik moment. There was an interesting piece in The Economist this week about Sputnik moments for a declining Europe on the robo-taxi front. How does Europe play into this? It seems to be increasingly squeezed between state innovation in China and the cult of the market in the United States. Is a Sputnik moment and in Europe, are there contradictions in terms?
Well, I'm originally from
I
Sweden.
apologize. That's a terrible error, Carl. Will you ever talk to me again?
I do have some German roots as well, as my father is German.
I know you and I often see each other at DLD, so it's a very German event. But anyway, you're a northern, rather than a German, you're a Northern European origin.
That is correct, but we share some of the same challenges with the Germans, and so what's really striking to me is not so much that Europe is less dynamic than the United States. That has been the case for a long time, but Europe actually managed to catch up to the US in manufacturing. So nobody would say that European car companies or pharmaceutical firms or electrical firms or chemical companies are not able to compete with their American counterparts. But in digital, it's a different story. And so why is that? I think a big part of the reason is that the single market is not harmonized for services in digital. And so the IMF estimates that the European Union, if you take the trade barriers and services and add them up, they would amount to something like 110% tariff. So Trump Liberation Day tariffs through non-tariff barriers inside the European single market. Why does that matter? Well, it caps the returns to investment in digital. If the market is fragmented and small, then the returns you can capture by investing in Europe are smaller. And then obviously, in addition to that, we have a lot of barriers to entry and innovation. Regulations like the GDPR hasn't made it easier and better for us. In fact, it's added a lot of compliance costs, and particularly to smaller firms that struggle to manage that. And larger companies like Meta and Google, they've actually captured a larger share of a market by offsetting compliance costs by that way. And so Europe has the challenge that innovation is more expensive and the returns in the case of success.
So what should the Europeans do? You've mentioned Google and Meta. They've been at the on the end of a lot of regulation. Is the European attempt to regulate innovative American technology, the Googles and the Metas of the world, is that the right or the wrong response?
Look, Europe is not going to get richer by leading in regulation. Now, there are good reasons to care about harms from AI and, want to regulate certain aspect of it. And most reasonable people will agree that you don't want LLMs trained on dangerous information, for example. And so you need to have procedures in place whereby you can make sure that foundation model providers don't do that. But Europe at the moment has a real growth problem. The US has a growth problem too, but it's not as bad as in Europe. And so right now, a lot of policymakers seem to think that we can regulate, but we can catch up through ambition.
So this is the Draghi argument, essentially.
Well, the Draghi argument also goes in the direction of what I mentioned earlier of harmonizing regulation and completing the single market. So I think there are different strands to that argument. But there are people saying we should do Airbus in AI, and Airbus was a successful project. There's no question about it. It created a peer competitor to Boeing, but it was also there was also a lot of efforts to create national semiconductor industries in Europe in the 60s and 70s, which failed dismally. And a key point that I think is worth making is that it's easy to catch up in a relatively static technology, in a technology that's relatively mature because you have a clear target. It's much harder when the target is moving and the pace of innovation is rapid, because you might invest in the infrastructure needed for large language models, but maybe the future of AI is small language models or something else, and we don't know. And therefore, it's not, I think, advisable to pool resources the same way that you did with Airbus into one technology when you need to.
So what's the model?
Your
Your book comes with a nice blurb from Tony Blair, who's hardly a paragon when it comes to, it seems, any kind of innovation. Are there models in Europe that work? I mean, you said the Airbus for AI won't work. Where can we look for models for Europe to reinvent itself and to actually keep up with the US and China, or offer an alternative model?
Well, going back to my previous point, I think you need to ask yourself, why do we not have these companies in Europe to begin with? And the reason is we need to harmonize the single market and services. That's the most important thing that needs to be done. And so, you have to fix the preconditions. We have to get rid of regulations that, create excessive burdens for startups setting up. And we need to give our universities more autonomy to compete for talent with the United States. We now have a golden opportunity in Europe because the United States has shot itself in the foot with its funding cuts for universities. So we now have a golden opportunity to attract talent. And we're not
so rather than a Sputnik moment, it's perhaps a Sputnik opportunity. Finally, Carl, what about the Chinese model of what we might think of as state capitalism? You talked about the failure of Soviet innovation. The Chinese, of course, took a very different kind of route, which seems to have been, in historical terms, much more successful. I'm curious whether you would agree with that. Is the Chinese model of innovation, of a state-centric one, which uses the market to promote itself in its own interests, is that a viable one for the 21st century in terms of your historical analysis?
So the Chinese model, I think it's important to realize, has evolved over time, right? So when China began to open up, there was a lot of industrial policy initiatives around Beijing. They didn't work particularly well, but there were also a lot of experiments in the south with new economic, with special economic zones, which allowed some provinces to integrate into global markets. And those reforms were tremendously successful. And China had some preconditions that enabled such experimentation in ways that weren't quite feasible in the Soviet Union, because in China, provinces were responsible for local economic development. And so what the Communist Party could do is to say, look, if you perform really well in terms of GDP per capita growth as provincial governor, you might be up for promotion. And so you had this, mayor economy inside China with leaders competing on growth targets and experimenting in ways that were unfeasible in the Soviet Union. Now, that relatively decentralized model has been, I would say, partly rolled back by the current government, which has centralized more decision-making in Beijing and in the hands of Xi in particular. And as China has pivoted to common prosperity and more national security-oriented objectives rather than growth, it has once again given state-owned enterprises a larger role to play. And what we know about state-owned enterprises is they are not very innovative, and they are not very productive. And so giving them an increasing role is going to undermine the dynamism of the Chinese economy. And more broadly, if you look across sectors, foreign invested firms and private companies are more productive. That said, China has a lot of talent, and it has a government that's still obsessed with technology and innovation. And China can certainly make some deep seeks, and they can be permitted to be successful as long as they serve national objectives. But national objectives, like in the Soviet Union, can change quickly. And that means that if you're a firm in China, you need to invest a lot in political capital to be on good terms with the government. It seems, unfortunately, that increasingly is the case in the United States as well. And so the US is becoming more like China. China is now becoming more like the West, which was the expectation. But in both cases, it means that firm needs to invest more in political capital, and that diverts resources away
Finally,
from
we had Simon Johnson on the show. His book was also, like yours, shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year. You're on the long list for 2025. I think his was on the list for 2023 or 2024. He won the Nobel Prize too. He attaches it seems to me, at least, in very simple terms, democracy and progress. He believes they go together. You haven't mentioned the D word at all, Carl, in any of this. Is it relevant in terms of how progress ends? Of course, it's not news to anyone these days that there seems to be a crisis of democracy, certainly in the United States, maybe in Western Europe. Is there any relationship between the end of democracy and the end of progress? Is it a chicken and egg argument? Is there a causal relationship between the two? Easy question to end with, Carl.
Democracy is relevant, and this is not my own research. It's research by Darren Acemoglu and others. But
yeah, and his book with, I think they won did they win the Nobel Prize together?
Exactly. They won the Nobel Prize together for different strand of research, but they have research showing that democracies tend to grow faster. We also have other research showing that if you look among autocracies, institutionalized autocracies rather than personal autocracies tend to grow faster. And so if you have a party apparatus that's able to remove underperforming executive, and you have a meritocratic civil service that can carry out essential activities, then those autocracies do better than autocracies that revolve around a single person. So that distinction is meaningful as well. But look, I don't think you can really have frontier innovation over the long run without giving people some form of ways of holding the government accountable, as long as that public itself is respecting of the rule of law and is respecting of private property. And so private property is still extremely important for investment, for innovation. The US patent system was second to none, and that's why America took the lead in innovation in the 19th century. But at the same time, you also need a public that holds companies accountable, and that foster tools that allow governments to check the political clout of private enterprise when it gets large and politically powerful. And we saw that in the Gilded Age. And, we may be in such a moment.
Well, wise words from Carl Benedict Frey, of Swedish origin. I made the fatal error of accusing him of being German. He's forgiven me. His new book, How Progress Ends, Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations is out. It's already been longlisted for the FT Book of the Year. A very important book about innovation, democracy, the state versus the Elon Musks of the world. Carl, lovely to have you on the show. Hope you'll forgive me and you'll come back on soon to talk more about this this all-important issue of how we innovate, how we realize progress rather than stall it, particularly in our AI age.